The wolf was inside the cabin with her. Three brothers had run out into the storm with their rifles to save the sheep, and the door had not closed all the way behind them. Adelaide Thornberry, 22 years old, 4 weeks out of Boston, had never fired a gun in her life until that week. Now the wolf came low and fast across the floorboards, its yellow eyes locked on her throat, and she had 3 seconds to decide whether the girl who had walked up a Montana mountain in a blizzard was the same girl who could pull a trigger to save her own life. This is the story of the woman who came west carrying a secret heavier than her own life, and the three mountain men who opened their door to a stranger in the worst storm of the winter. The wind came down off the high country first. It always did. It came scraping along the ridge lines of the Bitterroot Mountains like a knife being drawn slow across wet stone, and it carried with it the smell of pine sap frozen hard and wood smoke from cabins miles away, and something else, something older, something that the men who lived in those mountains had learned to respect the way other men respected loaded rifles and rattlesnakes. It carried the smell of a storm that was not yet a storm, but would be one before nightfall. Adelaide Thornberry did not know any of this. She had been raised in Boston in a tall, narrow house on a tree-lined street where the worst weather she had ever seen was a March nor'easter that piled wet gray slush against the front stoop and made the gas lamps flicker. She did not know how to read a Montana sky. She did not know that the high, thin clouds racing east above the timberline meant that within 6 hours, the world would turn white and silent, and that every living thing not already sheltered would be tested in ways the eastern cities could never imagine. She knew only that her boots were wrong. She knew that her navy traveling dress, the one she had spent 3 weeks of her last small wages having altered for this journey, was wrong. She knew that the cameo brooch at her throat, the one her mother had pinned there on the morning of her first communion 17 years ago, was the only thing she had left from a life that had ended somewhere between the train depot in Chicago and the bone-deep cold of the Montana Territory. She also knew, with the kind of clarity that comes only when a person has run out of every other option, that if she did not reach the cabin on the ridge before the light failed, she would not see the morning. The stagecoach had left her 3 miles back. The driver, a coarse man with a face like a bag of walnuts, and the eyes of a man who had seen too much and trusted nothing, had reined in his team at a fork in the trail and pointed up the slope with his whip. "You walk from here, miss." He said it without looking at her. "Bitterroot Ridge is straight up that draw. Ashford Place sits at the top. Can't miss it if you keep climbing." She had stared at him. 3 miles, she had said. "In this, there must be some other way." "There ain't," he had said. "Storm's coming. Hard. I got to get back down to Silver Creek before it hits, or me and the team are buzzard meat. Ain't no man getting paid enough to die for a city girl." He had spat tobacco juice into the snow at her feet. "Out here you walk or you die. Most folks pick walking. Good luck to you, miss." And then the stagecoach had turned the runners hissing on the packed snow, the horses blowing white plumes from their nostrils, and within a minute the shape of it had been swallowed up by the timber, and she had been alone on that mountain trail, with nothing but her trunk and her cameo, and the letter folded inside her glove, the letter that promised her a husband and a home and an end to running. She had lifted the trunk. She had set it down. She had lifted it again. And then, because there was no other choice in the world, she had begun to climb. That had been an hour ago, maybe 2. Time had stopped meaning anything the moment her toes had gone numb inside her boots. The light was going gray now, the kind of gray that turns blue at the edges, the kind of gray that means the day is dying. The wind had picked up. Snow had begun to spit out of the high clouds in slanting white needles that struck her cheeks and stuck to her eyelashes and would not melt. She thought about her father. She thought about him because she had nothing else to think about that did not bring her to her knees. She thought about Nathaniel Thornberry sitting at his desk in the small office on Beacon Hill, the green glass shade of his lamp casting circles of light across his ledgers, his pen scratching in that careful way of his, the way that had made him the most trusted bookkeeper in 3 counties, before a letter had come from a mining concern in Montana Territory offering him 3 times his salary for a single year of work. She thought about him kissing her forehead the morning he had left. She had been 17. He had told her he would be back before the autumn leaves fell. He had told her that he was going to make their fortune, that when he returned, they would buy a house in the country with apple trees and a horse for her to ride. He had told her that he loved her more than the world. He had not come back. What had come back 3 months later was a telegram from a man named Cassius Blackwood expressing his deepest sympathies and informing the family that Mr. Thornberry had been thrown from his horse on a mountain trail and had not survived the fall. The body, the telegram had said with regretful but firm words, could not be transported east due to the conditions in the distance. He had been buried in a small cemetery in Silver Creek, Montana, with all proper Christian rites. Her mother had read the telegram twice. She had folded it neatly in half. She had walked upstairs to the room she had shared with her husband for 19 years. And she had not come out again. Not really, not in any way that mattered. Charlotte Thornberry had lived another 4 months in that room before the grief took her, and when she had gone, Adelaide had been alone in the world at the age of 18 with nothing but the clothes she stood up in and a small collection of her father's books in a great empty house that the bank took within the year. Her Uncle Reginald had taken her in. He had not wanted to. He had made that clear within the first week in the small, cold ways that men like him have of making things clear without ever quite saying them. She had lived under his roof for 4 years, working as an unpaid governess to his children and a copyist in his law office in the evenings, and she had been told over and over again that she was a burden, that her presence was a charity, that she ought to be grateful that no respectable man would ever want a girl with no dowry and no prospects and a dead father and a mother who had wasted away from weakness of will. And then 6 months ago, her uncle had told her that he had arranged a marriage for her to a business associate of his, a widower, 63 years old, a man who needed a young wife to manage his household and bear him a son before his time ran out. Adelaide had not slept that night. She had sat at the small desk in her attic room, and she had taken down her father's old Bible from the shelf where she had kept it all these years, and she had held it in her hands, and she had thought about him, about the way he had laughed, about the smell of pipe tobacco on his coat collar, about the careful, neat handwriting in his ledgers. And as she had held the Bible, a folded slip of paper had fallen out from between 2 pages near the back. A slip of paper that had been there for 5 years and that she had somehow never found. Her father's handwriting, faded but unmistakable. If you are reading this, my darling girl, then I am gone. I'm sorry. There is a ledger hidden in the false bottom of the cedar trunk in the attic. What it contains is the truth. Cassius Blackwood is not what he seems. My death will not be an accident. I love you more than the world. Be careful. Be brave. Trust no one until you know they have earned it. She had read the letter 4 times. She had gone to the attic. She had found the cedar trunk, the one her father had built with his own hands when he had been a young man, and she had felt along the bottom until she had found the place where the wood gave just slightly under her fingers, and she had pried it up. Beneath it had been a leather-bound ledger, smaller than her father's usual books, the cover worn smooth from being handled. She had taken it to her room, and she had lit a candle, and she had read it. It had taken her until dawn. By the time the gray light of morning had begun to creep through her attic window, Adelaide Thornberry had understood 3 things. The first was that her father had been murdered. The second was that the man who had murdered him was named Cassius Blackwood, and that this man was a thief who had been salting his own mining claims and rigging the assay scales in Silver Creek for at least 7 years, robbing his own miners of thousands of dollars, and that her father had discovered all of it. The third thing she had understood was that if she stayed in Boston, if she married the old widower her uncle had chosen for her, she would spend the rest of her life knowing what she knew and doing nothing about it. And that she had decided as the candle had guttered down to nothing was a thing she could not do. But how? That had been the question that had haunted her for the next 2 months as she had moved through her uncle's house pretending nothing had changed. How does a 22-year-old girl from Boston with no money and no protection traveled 2,000 miles into a wild country to expose a powerful man without that powerful man hearing she was coming and having her killed before she ever set foot in his town? The answer had come to her in the form of a newspaper, the Matrimonial News, a periodical that arrived weekly at her uncle's office full of advertisements from Western men seeking Eastern wives. She had picked up a discarded copy on impulse one afternoon, and she had been reading through the listings without really reading them when one had caught her eye. Wife wanted, mountain rancher, Bitterroot Ridge, Montana territory. Hard life but a fair man. No heavy drinkers, no flighty girls. Inquire W. Ashford. She had folded the newspaper. She had gone to the small geography book in her uncle's library, and she had looked up Bitterroot Ridge. It was less than a day's ride from Silver Creek. She had written the letter that night. 3 weeks later, a reply had come in a strong, careful hand on cheap paper, and it had been short. Only 4 lines. Miss Thornberry, your letter has been received and considered. If you are still willing to come, I will meet you at the trailhead 1 mile north of the Silver Creek way station on the 18th of December. Bring only what you can carry. The mountain is not kind to those who arrive with too much. W. Ashford. She had stolen money from her uncle's desk drawer. $40. It was the worst thing she had ever done in her life. She had bought a one-way train ticket west. She had packed a single trunk. She had taken to her father's Bible and her cameo brooch, an address her mother had sewn for her when she had been 16. And she had hidden the leather-bound ledger in the false bottom of her trunk the way her father had taught her, and she had left Boston in the dark hours before her uncle's household had stirred. That had been 4 weeks ago. Now she was on a mountain in Montana, her boots packed with snow, her dress frozen stiff against her legs, the trunk dragging behind her like a dead thing. And the light was failing, and she did not know if she was going to make it. She fell for the first time about a half-mile from the cabin she could not yet see. She fell because her left foot had gone past numb into something worse, into something that did not feel like a foot at all anymore, and it had simply folded under her when she stepped on a hidden rock. She went down hard into the snow, and she lay there for a long moment with the wind howling above her and the snow stinging her face, and a thought came to her with terrible clarity. She could simply stay here. She could close her eyes. She had heard somewhere that freezing was not a bad way to die, that after the cold there came a warmth, and after the warmth there came sleep, and after the sleep there came nothing at all. She thought about her father. She got up. She did not know how she got up. Her legs did not seem to belong to her. But she got the trunk by its leather handle, and she dragged it forward, and she took one step and then another, and she kept her eyes on the place where she thought the cabin must be, even though she could not see it through the trees and the spitting snow. And she walked. She fell 3 more times in the next half hour. Each time she got up. Each time it took longer. The 4th time she thought she would not. She lay in the snow with her cheek pressed against the cold of it and her eyes half closed, and she could feel the warmth coming, just like she had heard the false warmth that the body sends when it is letting go, and she thought about how strange it was that dying felt like coming inside from the rain. And then somewhere in the distance, through the trees and the wind and the gathering blue dark, she saw a light, a small yellow light, the kind of light that comes from a window, the kind of light that means a fire and a roof and people inside. The cabin. Adelaide Thornberry pushed herself up onto her hands. She got her knees under her. She got one foot beneath her. She got the other. She left the trunk behind her in the snow because she could no longer lift it, but she remembered even in the swimming dark of her exhaustion to reach inside it and to pull out the leather-bound ledger and to clutch it inside her coat against her ribs where her body could keep it warm. Then she walked toward the light. 100 yards from the cabin door, she stopped being able to feel her hands. 50 yards from the cabin door, she stopped being able to feel her face. 20 yards from the cabin door, she fell for the last time, and this time she could not see the light anymore because the world had begun to gray at the edges, and the gray was coming in fast. But the cabin door was closer than she thought. Inside that cabin, three men were standing very still. Wyatt Ashford had been standing at the window for the better part of an hour, his big hands resting on the sill, his amber eyes fixed on the trail that climbed up through the timber. He had not moved much. He had not spoken at all. He was 33 years old, and he stood 6 feet 7 inches in his stocking feet. And the years on the mountain had carved him into something that looked less like a man and more like a piece of the country itself, all hard angles and quiet weight, and a stillness that other men sometimes mistook for slowness until they saw him move. Behind him at the long pine table, his middle brother Crawford sat with a harmonica in his hands, turning it over and over without playing it. Crawford was 29 and he was almost as tall as his older brother, and he had hair the color of dark honey and amber eyes that were a shade lighter and warmer than Wyatt's. He was the one in the family who smiled most easily, who could tell a story by the fire that would make even Ezra laugh, who carried inside him the kind of quiet kindness that the Bitterroot country had not yet managed to grind out of him. Right now, however, he was not smiling. He was watching his older brother's back with the careful eyes of a man who has known another man for a long time and can read his weather like reading the sky. At the far end of the table, the youngest brother sat whittling a piece of cedar with a knife so sharp it shaved curls off the wood as fine as corn silk. Ezra Ashford was 25 years old. He was the smallest of the three, which meant only that he stood 6 feet 5 instead of 6 feet 6 or 6 feet 7. He had hair the color of chestnut bark and eyes that were a deeper amber than either of his brothers, and he wore on the inside of his left forearm the puckered scar of an old rope burn from his ranching work as a boy. He did not look up from his whittling. He did not need to. He could feel his older brother standing by the window the way a horse can feel a coming storm. Wyatt Crawford said quietly, "You've been at that window since noon." Wyatt did not answer. "You expecting somebody big, brother?" Wyatt did not answer. Ezra spoke without looking up. "Maybe he is waiting on a bear to wander by, so he has an excuse to shoot one." Crawford gave a small huff that might almost have been a laugh. Then his eyes went back to his older brother, and the small, almost smile died on his mouth. "Wyatt," he said again more gently this time, "what is going on? You have been pacing for 3 days. You have been watching that trail like a man waiting on the second coming. We have known you all our lives, and we have never seen you like this. Tell us what is wrong." Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his wool shirt and he pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it for a moment without looking at it. Then he walked over to the table and he set it down in front of Crawford and he stepped back. Crawford picked it up. He unfolded it. He read it. His face did not change at first, and then it did, and he handed it to Ezra. Ezra read it. Ezra set down his knife. Ezra looked up at his older brother, and his amber eyes were wide and dark, and the youngest brother's voice when it came was very quiet. "You did what?" Wyatt did not answer. "You answered an advertisement," Ezra said. "You answered a matrimonial advertisement. You ordered a wife through the mail, and you did not tell us." Wyatt looked at his hands. When Crawford asked, "When did you do this?" "2 months ago." "And you have a reply," Crawford said, "and the date in the letter is today." "Yes." The brothers were silent. It was Ezra who spoke first, and his voice had hardened the way the youngest brother's voice always hardened when he was hurt and trying not to show it. "We agreed," he said, "after Lenore and the baby went after we lost your wife and your daughter. We agreed no more women in this house, no more letting strangers in. We agreed, Wyatt. You said it yourself. You said the mountain takes what it wants, and we would not give it any more chances. And now you have brought a woman up here in December without telling either one of us." "I could not keep on the way we were," Wyatt said. He was looking down at the table now, at the place where his big calloused hands rested flat on the pine boards. "I could not keep waking up alone in that bed, Ezra. I could not keep walking past the place behind the cabin where they are buried and feeling like the only thing left of me was the part that was buried with them. I am 33 years old. I have been alone for 5 years. And one night about 2 months ago, I sat at this table after you boys had gone to sleep, and I wrote that advertisement in the paper because I did not know what else to do." He raised his head. He looked at his brothers. I did not think anyone would answer. Crawford reached across the table and put a hand on his older brother's wrist, the kind of touch that brothers give each other when words are not quite enough. "Wyatt," he said, "Lenora would have wanted you to live, not just to keep on, to live. You hear me? You hear what I am telling you." Ezra stood up from the table. The youngest brother's face had gone pale and tight in the way it always did when something hurt him deep, and he turned away from the lamp and walked to the door and pulled his coat down off the peg and shrugged into it. "Where are you going?" Crawford said. "Out to the barn," Ezra said without turning around. "Going to check the horses." He opened the door. The wind came in, cold air and a few flakes of spitting snow. And then Ezra Ashford stopped. He stopped because Copper had stood up. The big golden retriever had been lying by the hearth all afternoon, his graying muzzle on his paws, his soft eyes half closed, content with the warmth and the smell of cedar shavings and the quiet rumble of his men's voices. Now he was on his feet. The hackles along his shoulders were standing up. His ears were pricked forward toward the open door. A low sound was coming out of his chest, not a growl exactly, something deeper than that, something older. It was the sound a dog makes when he hears something his men cannot hear yet. "What is it?" Crawford said. "Bear." Ezra was already stepping back from the door, his hand reaching for the rifle that hung on the pegs beside it. Wyatt had risen from the table and was moving toward the window again, and his big hand was already on the butt of the long Colt revolver at his hip. Copper barked. Once. A deep, urgent bark that he saved for things that mattered. And then faintly, almost lost in the wind, came a sound from outside. It was not a sound any of the brothers expected. It was not the snuffle of a bear. It was not the howl of a wolf. It was not the wheeze of a winded horse. It was three soft taps. Three small, careful knocks against the heavy oak of the cabin door, so light that they should not have been heard at all over the rising storm. So light that without Copper standing there with his hackles up and his ears forward, none of the three brothers would have known they had been knocked at all. The brothers froze. Wyatt moved first. He crossed the room in three long strides, and he pulled the door open, and the wind came in like a living thing, and the lamp on the table guttered, and the fire in the hearth jumped sideways. And there in the gray-blue dusk on the snow, piled up against the threshold, lay the small, dark shape of a woman. She was not moving. Wyatt was on his knees beside her in an instant. His big hand went to her throat to find the pulse, and for one terrible moment, he could not feel anything. And then he did faint and slow and far away. He gathered her up. She weighed almost nothing in his arms. Her dress was frozen so stiff that it crackled when he lifted her, and her lips were the color of slate, and her honey-colored hair was matted to her cheek with ice, and one of her small white hands was clutched against her chest as though she were holding something there. Even in her unconsciousness, something she would not let go of even now. "Get the door," Wyatt said. His voice was rough. Crawford got the door. Ezra was already pulling blankets down from the loft and pushing them toward the hearth. Copper was circling the woman in his master's arms, whining low in his throat, his nose pressing at her hand and her face and her hair, as though he were trying to wake her up by sheer force of will. Wyatt laid her down by the fire. He worked fast. He pulled off her boots and tossed them aside, and his face went hard when he saw her feet through the wet stockings. He pulled a heavy buffalo robe down from the wall, and he wrapped her in it, and he pulled it tight under her chin, and he chafed her hands between his own great rough ones, and he spoke to her in a low, steady voice that none of his brothers had heard him use since the night his daughter Cordelia had been dying in his arms 5 winters ago. "Easy now," he said. "Easy now. You are inside. You are warm. I have got you. Easy now." The two younger Ashford brothers stood back and watched their older brother work. They did not speak. They had never seen Wyatt move quite like this. There was something in the way his hands moved over the half-frozen woman, something that was neither tender nor rough, but somehow both at once, the way a man handles a thing he is afraid to break and afraid to lose. Crawford was the first to speak. "Wyatt," he said quietly. "Is that her?" Wyatt did not look up. "I do not know." "Look in her hand," Ezra said. Wyatt looked. The woman's right hand, the one she had clutched against her chest, was curled tight around something. He worked her fingers open one at a time. Inside her glove, pressed against the palm, was a folded piece of paper. He drew it out and he opened it. It was the letter he had written. The 4 lines in his own careful hand. The 18th of December. The trailhead north of Silver Creek. His face went very still. "Yes," he said, "it is her." For a long moment, none of the 3 brothers said anything. The wind was rising outside. The fire was burning. Copper had settled himself with his big golden body pressed against the woman's side, sharing his warmth, his soft eyes fixed on her face. And then the woman moved. It was the smallest movement. Her eyelids fluttered. Her lips parted. A sound came out of her, a sound that was not quite a word, and Wyatt Ashford leaned closer to her and put his ear almost against her mouth. She tried again. "Are you?" she whispered. "Mr. Ashford?" "I am," he said. She tried to open her eyes. She managed it for a half-second, long enough for Wyatt Ashford and his 2 brothers and the old golden dog by the hearth to see that her eyes were the color of cornflowers in a spring meadow back east. Long enough for her to find Wyatt's face in the firelight. "I am," she whispered, "your bride." Her eyes closed again. Wyatt Ashford was very still for a long moment. Then he reached up with his great calloused hand and he brushed a strand of frozen honey-colored hair back from her forehead, and his voice when it came was so quiet that his brothers could barely hear it over the crackling of the fire. "You are home now, Miss Thornberry," he said. "You are home now." Behind him, Crawford set down the harmonica he had been holding all this time without realizing it. Ezra leaned the rifle gently back against the wall by the door. Neither brother spoke. Neither brother had words for what they had just seen, for the way their older brother's voice had broken on those 4 small words, for the way a stranger had just walked into their cabin out of a blizzard and changed everything they thought they knew about the rest of their winter. Outside, the wind rose. The snow came down harder, slanting in thick white sheets across the timber and the trail, and the place where Adelaide Thornberry's small leather trunk lay half buried already, the ledger gone from inside it, now gone with her into the cabin and into the keeping of 3 men who did not yet know they were about to be drawn into a fight that had been waiting 5 years for the right hand to bring it to light. Copper laid his big golden head down across the woman's small white hand. He sighed once, a long sigh, the sigh of a dog who has been waiting for something a very long time without knowing he was waiting. And in the dark beyond the timber, where no man inside the cabin could see a single rider, sat his horse on the high trail above Bitterroot Ridge. He had been there for the better part of an hour. He had watched the small, dark shape of a woman struggling up the draw with her trunk and falling and rising and falling and rising again. He had watched her go inside. He had marked the cabin and the hour and the number of horses in the corral. Now he turned his horse without a word and pointed his nose back down the mountain towards Silver Creek, where a man who paid him in gold coin would want to know before the night was over that the daughter of Nathaniel Thornberry had finally come west. Inside the cabin, the fire burned. The 3 brothers stood watch over the woman by the hearth. Outside, the storm closed in. The fire was the first thing she knew when she came back to the world. Not the warmth of it, the sound, the slow popping of resin and cedar logs, the hiss of a knot, letting go of its sap, the steady breathing of a fire that had been tended through a long night by careful hands. She listened to it for a long time before she opened her eyes. She listened the way a person listens when they are not yet sure whether they are alive or whether what they are hearing is something on the other side of the door of dying. Then she felt the weight on her hand, something warm and solid and breathing, something that smelled of clean fur and pine pitch, and the dust of an old wool blanket. Adelaide Thornbury opened her eyes by inches and looked down across the buffalo robe that covered her, and what she saw was the broad golden head of a bone laid across her right wrist as though it had been there for hours and had no intention of moving. The dog's eyes were open. The dog's eyes were watching her. When she stirred, the dog's tail moved once, a slow, heavy thump against the pine boards of the floor. The dog did not lift his head. He only watched her with those soft brown eyes, and there was such a quiet, patient kindness in them that Adelaide felt something inside her that had been frozen for 4 weeks and 1,000 miles begin very slowly to crack. She tried to speak. Her throat was raw. The sound that came out was not a word. A man's voice answered her from somewhere across the room. "She is awake," the voice said. "Wyatt." There were footsteps on the boards. A figure crossed in front of the firelight and knelt beside her, and Adelaide turned her head on the pillow she had not known was under it and looked up into a face she had never seen before. It was a young man's face, or young by the standards of the country she had come from. A man with sunstreaks and honey-colored hair and amber eyes that were warm in the firelight, and a careful, soft smile at the corners of his mouth. He wore a wool shirt the color of wet bark, and his hands, when he reached for the buffalo robe to draw it a little higher under her chin, were big and square and gentle. "You are awake, miss," he said. "That is the best news this cabin has heard in a long while. Do not try to talk yet. Your throat will hurt for a day or two. The cold does that." She watched him. "I am Crawford," the man said. "My brothers call me Craw. Most folks do. You are at the Ashford place on Bitterroot Ridge. You came to our door last night in the storm. Do you remember?" She remembered the snow. She remembered the light. She remembered falling and not being able to get up. She nodded once, a tiny motion against the pillow. "Good," Crawford said. "That is good. My older brother brought you in. He sat with you most of the night. He has gone out to the barn just now to see to the stock. He will be back directly. My younger brother is sleeping by the table. He sat with you the second part of the night. We did not want you to wake up alone." Adelaide felt her eyes burn at that, and she did not know why. She closed them again for a moment. "The dog," she whispered. Her voice was a thread. Crawford's smile widened just a little. "That is Copper," he said. "He has not left your side since Wyatt set you down. We tried to feed him this morning. He would not eat. He has decided you are his job today, miss, and there is no arguing with him when he gets that look in his eye." She tried to smile back. She was not sure her face remembered how. Crawford rose, then slowly, the way a man rises from a sick bed when he does not want to startle the patient. "I'm going to bring you some broth," he said. "Plain. Beef and a little salt. That is all your stomach will take this morning. And I am going to bring you a cup of warm water for your throat. Do not try to sit up by yourself. You are not strong enough yet. If you need anything, you tap your hand on the boards there, and Copper will come fetch one of us. He has done it before." He went to the iron stove at the far end of the room, and Adelaide listened to him moving among the pots and the cups, and she let her eyes wander. The cabin was not what she had expected. She realized now, something rough. Something that smelled of unwashed men and wet boots and tobacco smoke ground into the floors. Something where a city girl would feel afraid of touching anything for fear of what was on it. That was the picture her Uncle Reginald had drawn for her more than once when she had told him about the matrimonial advertisement, and he had laughed at her and called her a fool. But this cabin was clean. The pine floor had been swept that morning. The hearthstones themselves had been scrubbed. The mantel above the fireplace held a row of carefully made things, a tin lamp polished to a shine, a small wooden carving of a horse that someone had whittled with patience and skill, a folded cloth with blue thread embroidered along its edge in a pattern of small flowers. Someone had loved this house once. Someone had loved it enough that the men who lived in it now still kept it the way she had taught them. There was a sound from across the room. A soft sound, a man waking up. Adelaide turned her head the other way and saw at the long pine table a third man, lifting his head from where it had been resting on his folded arms. He had been asleep there. He was younger than Crawford, perhaps in his middle 20s, with hair the color of chestnut bark and eyes that took a moment to focus. When they did focus, they focused on her, and she saw his whole face change. He had been dreaming, she thought, and the moment he had remembered where he was, the moment he had remembered there was a strange woman in his brother's cabin. The gentleness of sleep had gone out of his face, and something else had come into it. Not anger, not quite suspicion either. Something more careful than that. Something more guarded. The look of a young man who had decided a long time ago that nothing good came easily, and that anyone who arrived in his life unexpectedly was probably going to take something from it before they left. Ezra Crawford said from the stove without turning around, "She is awake. Do not stare at her like that. You will scare her." "I am not staring," the youngest brother said. "You are." Ezra Ashford pushed himself up from the table. He stood, and Adelaide realized for the first time how tall these men were. He came around the table with the careful walk of a man who did not quite know what to do with a woman in his house, and he stopped a respectful 5 feet from where she lay, and he looked down at her with those guarded amber eyes. "Miss," he said. She did not know if it was a greeting or a question. She nodded to him. "Are your feet hurting yet?" he said. "Because they will. In about an hour, when the warmth gets all the way back into them. It is going to feel like 100 bee stings inside your boots. I just wanted to tell you so it does not surprise you. My brother Craw has some salve we can put on them." It was the longest speech he had made, and it came out fast, as though he had been holding it ready and was relieved to get it out and be done with it. Then he turned and walked to the door and pulled on his coat and went out into the morning without another word. Crawford watched him go, and then he turned to Adelaide, and his quiet smile had come back. "Do not mind Ezra," he said. "He is not unfriendly. He is only careful. Our mother left us when he was 8 years old, and our father did not last long after, and Ezra has been waiting ever since for the next person to walk out the door. Give him a few days. He will warm to you." He brought the broth in a tin cup, and he helped her sit up against the pillow and the rolled blanket behind her, and he handed her the cup and watched her with the patient air of a man who has helped sick animals before. "Small sips," he said. "Slow." She drank. The broth was warm and salty and tasted like the most extravagant thing she had ever put in her mouth. She felt it travel down into her chest, and she felt the heat of it spread out from her stomach, the way a small sun might, and she had to close her eyes because it was so good. She did not trust herself not to cry. Crawford waited. When she had drunk half the cup, he gently took it from her hand and set it on a small wooden stool beside her makeshift bed. "Now you rest," he said. "There is no hurry to do anything else this morning. My brother Wyatt will be in directly, and he will want to speak with you, but only when you are ready. He is not a hurrying man. He is the most patient man I know." She nodded. "Your trunk is here," Crawford added. He pointed across the room to where her small leather trunk sat by the wall. "We found it about 100 yards down the trail this morning. It was buried, but the handle was sticking up. Wyatt walked out and got it. The lock is still on it. We did not open it. That is your business, miss, and not ours." She felt her hand move involuntarily toward her chest where the ledger had been, and her face must have shown her panic because Crawford spoke again very softly. "The book you were carrying is on the small table by the head of your bed. Wyatt put it there last night. He did not look at it. He would not. He said it was yours." She turned her head on the pillow, and there it was, the leather-bound ledger, sitting on a small, three-legged table not 8 inches from her face, untouched, closed, waiting for her. Adelaide Thornberry closed her eyes, and a single hot tear ran sideways down her temple into her hair. She did not know how long she slept after that. When she woke again, the light through the small window above the wash basin had moved across the room and was now lying in a long, pale stripe across the floorboards near the hearth. The fire had been built up. Copper was still beside her, but his head was up now, and his ears were turned toward the door, and his tail was thumping slowly against the boards in a rhythm that meant something was about to happen that he was glad about. The door opened. A man came in. By that time, Adelaide had been moved. Crawford and Ezra had carried her makeshift bed blankets, in all, into the small back bedroom of the cabin in the early afternoon, while Wyatt had been finishing the work on the door. The room was small, but it was warm with its own little iron stove in the corner that shared a flue with the main hearth in a single window that looked out across the snow toward the line of timber and a heavy oak door with a brand new bolt on the inside of it. They had set her bed against the wall under the window, and they had brought in the small three-legged table and set it beside her with the leather-bound ledger on top of it, and they had not said a word about any of it while they worked. Now the door of the small back bedroom opened. A man came in. She had thought in the half memory of the night before that she had imagined how big he was. She had not. Wyatt Ashford filled the doorway when he stepped through it the way a horse fills a stall, and he had to bend his head a little to clear the lintel. Snow was on the shoulders of his heavy wool coat. Snow was caught in the dark hair that fell across his forehead and in the two-day stubble along his strong, square jaw. He carried a small armload of cut firewood, and he set it down beside the little iron stove in the corner without looking at her, and only then did he take off his coat and shake the snow from his hat and hang both on the peg by the door. When he turned, she saw his eyes for the first time in daylight. They were the color of whiskey held up to a candle. They were tired. They had not slept much. And when they found her where she lay propped against her pillow with Copper at her side, they did not slide away the way the eyes of polite Boston men had always slid away from her, and they did not crawl over her the way the eyes of her uncle's business associates had crawled. They simply looked at her steady and quiet, the way a man looks at something he has been thinking about for a long time and is now seeing in front of him for the first time in the daylight. "Miss Thornberry," he said. His voice was deep and slow and unhurried. "I am glad to see you sitting up." She tried to speak. Her voice was still not much. "Mr. Ashford," she managed. "Wyatt," he said. "Just Wyatt if it suits you. We do not stand much on titles up here." She nodded. He crossed the room and stopped at a respectful distance from her, the same 5 feet his younger brother had kept, and he stood there with his big hands hanging at his sides as though he did not quite know what to do with them in the presence of a woman. Then he seemed to decide something, and he pulled a low wooden stool from beside the table, and he set it down at the edge of her sight far enough away not to crowd her close enough that she could hear him without straining, and he sat. "Miss Thornberry," he said again, "I owe you some words. I would like to say them now if you are well enough to listen. If you are not, they will keep until tomorrow. There is no hurry on them." "I can listen," she said. He nodded. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he raised his eyes to hers, and he spoke slowly the way a man speaks when he has thought about every word he is going to say and has decided not to leave any of them out. "I do not know what you imagined," he said, "when you read my advertisement, and when you wrote me back, and when you got on a train, and when you came 2,000 miles to a place you had never seen. I do not know what picture you had in your mind of me or of this cabin or of the kind of life that was waiting for you here. But I want you to know one thing before anything else gets said between us. You are not bound to anything." She watched him. She did not move. "You are not bound to me," he said. "You are not bound to this cabin. You are not bound to a single promise that was made or implied in any letter that passed between us. The storm has the pass closed, and it will be closed until the spring thaw, and there is no leaving Bitterroot Ridge until then. But that is the mountain holding you, Miss Thornberry. That is not me. When the snow goes off the trail in April or May, if you wish to ride down to Silver Creek and take the stage east and go back to whatever you came from, I will saddle a horse for you myself, and I will pay your passage all the way back to Boston with the money I have set aside for the spring cattle, and I will not say one word against it. That is my first promise to you." He paused. He made sure she had heard it. "My second promise," he said, "is that this room is yours. The door has a bolt on it. I put a new one on it this morning before you woke. The bolt is on the inside. You will be the only person in this cabin who can lock or unlock that door. My brothers and I will sleep out in the barn loft. There is a stove out there and plenty of hay, and we will be warm enough. None of us will set foot inside this room while you are in it without your invitation. Not me, not Craw, not Ezra, not for any reason. You have my word on that, and a man keeps his word. She felt her eyes burning again. She did not let the tears come this time. My third promise, he said, and his voice went a shade quieter, is the hardest one to say. I want you to hear it anyway. I do not know you, Miss Thornberry. You do not know me. We have written 4 lines apiece on a piece of paper. That is not a marriage. That is not even a courtship. That is 2 strangers who agreed to try to find out if there might be something worth building between them. So here is what I am going to ask of you. I am going to ask you to spend this winter in my house as my guest. Not as my bride, as my guest. I am going to ask you to eat at my table and warm yourself at my fire, and let my brothers and I look after you the way we would look after any soul the mountain sent to our door in a storm. And in the spring when the pass opens, I am going to ask you to tell me one of 2 things. You will tell me that you are going home, or you will tell me that you would like to stay and that you would like the 2 of us to begin slowly and properly to find out whether we might learn to care for one another in the way that a husband and a wife should. And whichever of those 2 things you tell me, I will accept it without argument and without bitterness and without 1 ounce of pressure on you of any kind. He stopped. The cabin was very quiet. The fire popped softly. Copper had been listening too, in the way that good dogs listen, and his tail had stopped its slow thumping, and he was watching his master's face. Adelaide Thornberry could not speak for a long moment. When she could, her voice was barely above the sound of the fire. Mr. Ashford, she said, Wyatt, I have lived in my uncle's house for 4 years. In those 4 years, I do not believe any man spoke to me with as much respect as you have spoken to me in the last 2 minutes. Wyatt looked down at his hands. I am sorry to hear that, miss. That was not respect. That was only common decency. A man owes that to any woman he sits across the table from. She did not know what to say to that, so she said the only thing she could think of. Thank you. He nodded once. Then he rose from the stool slowly, the way he did everything, and he crossed to the small iron stove in the corner and laid 2 more pieces of cedar inside it and watched them catch through the open grate. With his back to her, his face turned toward the flames, he spoke one more time. There is one more thing, Miss Thornberry, and then I will leave you to rest. Yes, you came up that mountain in the storm last night carrying a trunk and a book. The book you were holding inside your coat against your ribs the way a person holds a thing they will not let go of even if it costs them their life. I do not know what is in that book. I will not ask. I will never ask. Whatever brought you across 2,000 miles of country in the worst month of the year is your business and yours alone. And you will tell me about it when and if you decide to and not before. But I want you to know this. Whatever it is, you do not have to carry it by yourself anymore. Not while you are under my roof. Not while my brothers and I are here. The mountain does not care, Miss Thornberry, but I do, and so do they. He turned then and looked at her one last time. You are home now, he said. For the winter at the very least, you are home. He went to the door. He took his coat down. He paused with his hand on the latch. Sleep, he said gently. Craw will bring you supper this evening. If you need anything before then, you tell Copper. He knows where to find me. He opened the door. He stepped through it. He closed it softly behind him. Adelaide Thornberry lay very still on her pillow for a long time after he had gone. Outside the small window, the snow that had been falling all night had slowed at last to a few drifting flakes, and a thin pale light, or from a winter sun she could not see, was finding its way down into the high country. She thought about her father. She thought about her uncle's house in Boston, the cold attic room, the locked drawers, the watchful eyes, the man her uncle had picked out for her, with his thinning gray hair and his liver-spotted hands. She thought about the 4 weeks of trains and stagecoaches and way stations and the long, terrible climb up the mountain in the dark. She thought about a man with whiskey-colored eyes who had built a bolt on the inside of a door before she was awake to ask for one. For the first time in 5 years since the morning her father had kissed her forehead and walked out into a Boston spring, Adelaide Thornberry closed her eyes inside a house and felt safe. She slept. Outside the cabin, the wind was beginning to settle. The clouds were thinning along the high peaks. The storm that had brought her up the mountain was passing on east toward the plains, leaving behind it a world buried in white. In the loft of the barn, the three Ashford brothers were laying out their blankets on the hay. They worked without speaking for a while. Then Crawford broke the silence. "She is a brave one, Wyatt." Wyatt did not answer at first. He was rolling his coat into a pillow with the slow, careful motions of a man who was doing the work of his hands so that he would not have to think about the work of his heart. "She came up that mountain alone in a storm," Crawford went on quietly. "She came 2,000 miles. She walked the last three carrying a trunk that was probably half her own weight. And the first thing she did when she could speak was apologize for taking your bed." I noticed Wyatt said. Ezra, sitting on a hay bale across the loft, had been quiet through all of it. Now he spoke without looking up. "She is not what I thought she would be." "What did you think she would be?" Crawford asked. "I do not know," Ezra said. "Soft, maybe, spoiled. The kind of woman who runs at the first hard winter." He paused. "She is not that, no," Wyatt said. "She is not." The three brothers were quiet for a while. Outside somewhere in the timber, a great horned owl called once and then was silent. Wyatt, Crawford said at last. "What?" "You did the right thing in there, just now, with those three promises. I want you to know that." Lenora would have been proud of the man who said those words. Wyatt did not answer for a long moment. When he did, his voice was rough at the edges. "I do not know if I did the right thing, Craw. I do not know what the right thing is anymore. I only know that I am going to keep her safe this winter. After that, the spring will decide what it decides." "The spring is a long way off," Crawford said. "I know," Wyatt said. He blew out the lantern. In the cabin, in the small bedroom with the bolt on the inside of the door, the woman they had been speaking of slept on. The leather-bound ledger sat on the small, three-legged table beside her bed, untouched. And out beyond the timber, far down the mountain, in the toky, lamp-lit back room of a saloon in the town of Silver Creek, a man with a heavy gold watch chain across his vest was reading a folded note that had just been brought to him by a rider who had come in out of the storm. The note was short. It contained only a name, a place, and a date. The man with the gold watch chain read the note twice. Then he held it to the candle flame on the table beside him, and he watched it burn down to ash between his fingers, and he did not flinch when the last of the flame licked his skin. He smiled. He had been waiting 5 years for that name to come west. Cassius Blackwood folded his hands on the table in front of him and thought about that for a long time. Then he reached for a piece of paper and a pen, and he began to write. The first thing Adelaide Thornberry learned about life on Bitterroot Ridge was that the cold was not an enemy. The cold was a teacher. It taught her things in the order it wanted to teach them, and it did not allow her to skip any lessons. It taught her on her second morning that wet wool was worse than no wool at all. It taught her on her third morning that a person could not simply fling open a cabin door in December the way a person flung open a door in Boston, because the rush of cold air that came through could put the fire out before a man had time to step across the room. It taught her that water left in a tin cup overnight on the floor near the wall would have ice in the bottom of it by sunrise, even with the hearth burning. It taught her that her hands, the small, white hands her uncle's wife had once said were her only good feature, would crack along the knuckles within a week if she did not learn to rub them with bear grease at night the way Crawford rubbed his. She learned all of this without complaint. She learned because her mother had taught her when she was a very small girl that complaining was a thing women did when they had decided to stop being useful. And Adelaide Thornberry had decided a long time before she ever set foot on a westbound train that she was not going to stop being useful, not for any winter and not for any cold and not for any pain in her cracked hands. By the end of her first week in the Ashford cabin, she could walk again. By the end of her second week, the worst of the frostbite had passed, and her feet had stopped hurting at night, and she could put on a pair of borrowed wool socks that Crawford had laid out for her 2 sizes too big, and shuffle across the boards in them without wincing. By the end of her third week, she had begun to take over the small tasks of the cabin in the quiet, stubborn way that women take over a household when they have decided it is going to be theirs, whether anyone asks them to or not. She did not announce any of this. She simply began doing things. On the morning of her 10th day in the cabin, Crawford came in from the barn with his arms full of split kindling, and he stopped just inside the door and stared at the long pine table. There was a cloth on it. It was only a flour sack that had been washed clean and folded twice along its length, but it had been laid down the center of the table, the way a cloth was laid down in a house where a woman lived, and on top of it sat the tin coffee pot and 3 speckled tin cups in a small carved wooden bowl that someone had filled with the dried red berries of the mountain ash that grew along the south side of the cabin. Crawford set down his kindling without taking his eyes off the table. Then he turned slowly and looked across the room to where Adelaide sat by the hearth with a wooden darning egg in her hand and one of his older brother's wool socks pulled tight over it. She did not look up. She was very intent on the sock. "I notice things have changed in here," Crawford said carefully. "The sock had a hole," she said without raising her eyes. "Mr. Ashford has been wearing it through. I am only mending what was torn. I see that." And the table looked bare. "It did," Crawford said. "Now that you mention it, I suppose it always has." He came across the room and sat down on the bench across from her chair, and he watched her work for a long moment. Her hands were small, but they moved with the certainty of hands that had been taught well. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. "My mother taught me," she said. "She used to say that a woman who could not mend a sock was a woman who had never loved anyone enough to want their feet to be warm." Crawford was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like she was a good woman," he said. "She was," Adelaide said. Her voice did not break. She had decided on the train somewhere west of Chicago that she was finished with letting her voice break when she spoke about her mother and her father. Crawford watched her for another moment. Then he rose and went to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot she had set there, and he brought one to her without asking if she wanted it and set it on the small stool beside her chair. She looked up then. He was smiling at her. "You are good for this house, Miss Thornberry," he said. She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. And Crawford did not seem to expect an answer. He took his coffee and sat back down across from her, and he reached into the pocket of his wool shirt and brought out the harmonica he carried everywhere, and he began to play very softly a tune she did not know. It was slow and so and beautiful. Adelaide listened, and her needle slowed and then stopped, and she sat with the half-mended sock in her lap and listened to a man play his loneliness into the cabin air on a winter morning. When he was done, he tapped the harmonica against his palm to clear it and put it back in his pocket. "What was that?" she asked. "A song my mother used to sing," he said, "before she went away." He did not say more than that. He did not need to. Adelaide had been in the cabin long enough by now to have understood from things Wyatt had said, and from things he had carefully not said, that the mother of these 3 brothers had not died. She had left. She had walked off this mountain one summer morning when Ezra had been 8 years old, and had gone east with a man who sold sewing machines from town to town along the territorial roads, and she had never written and she had never come back. The brothers did not speak of her often. When they did not speak of her with anger, which was somehow the saddest thing about it. She thought about it again that evening when Ezra came in, stamping snow from his boots and carrying a brace of rabbits over one shoulder, and she saw him stop in the doorway and stare at the table the same way Crawford had stared at it that morning, and she saw the youngest brother's face do something complicated before he looked away and pretended he had not noticed anything at all. She thought about it again when Wyatt came in last of all after the early winter dark, and he set his rifle in the rack by the door and turned and saw the table set for supper with 3 plates and 3 forks and a 4th place laid carefully at the foot, And he stood there for what felt like a very long time, and then he crossed to the hearth and took off his coat and hung it on the peg and walked over and pulled out the chair at the foot of the table and held it for her, without a word. Adelaide felt her face go warm. She crossed the room and she sat down in the chair he was holding. And Wyatt Ashford pushed it gently in for her, the way she imagined a man might have pushed in a chair for a fine lady at a Boston dinner party, except that this man had hands the size of dinner plates and a 2-day stubble on his jaw, and he smelled of pine sap and clean cold air and the smoke of the hearth fire, and not one of those things was ugly to her. Not one of them. He took his own seat at the head of the table without looking at her. Crawford brought the rabbit stew over from the stove and ladled it out, and they ate in the kind of comfortable quiet that takes a long time to grow between people who have been strangers, the kind of quiet that does not need to be filled because everyone in it is content to be where they are. When the meal was almost done, Wyatt set down his spoon and looked across the length of the table at her. "Miss Thornberry," he said. "Yes, I want to thank you for the table." "It is only a flour sack," she said. He looked at her. His amber eyes in the lamplight were very steady. "It is not the cloth, miss. It is what the cloth means." He did not say anything more than that, and he went back to his stew, and Adelaide Thornberry sat at the foot of a long pine table in a cabin 2,000 miles from anywhere she had ever called home. And she felt something inside her chest that the long Boston years had pressed flat and small until she had nearly forgotten it was there at all. She felt seen. The days began to take on a rhythm after that. It was not a rhythm she had chosen. It had chosen her in the way the cold had chosen her. The mountain set the pace, and the mountain was patient, and the mountain did not care whether she had been a city girl 2 months ago, or whether her dress had once been the latest cut from a Boston tailor. In the morning, Crawford rose first, always before the others, and he went out into the dark and brought in the wood and built up the fire from the banked coals so that the cabin would be warm before his older brother and his younger brother came in for breakfast. By her second week, Adelaide had begun to rise when she heard him moving, and she would meet him at the stove with the coffee pot ready to be filled. After breakfast, Wyatt would go out to see to the stock. He had 4 horses and a milk cow and a half a dozen hens and a small cluster of sheep that he had been trying for 2 years to build into a flock. And he tended them all with the slow, careful patience of a man who understood that animals were not servants, but partners in the work of staying alive in a country that wanted him dead. Adelaide began to follow him out on the 3rd week wrapped in a wool shawl that Crawford had dug out of a trunk in the loft, and she would stand quietly at the rail of the corral and watch him work, and on the morning of her 17th day on the mountain, she walked into the barn behind him and held out her hand for the milk pail. He looked at her. "I would like to learn," she said. He did not argue with her. He showed her how to wash the cow's flank with a handful of clean snow, first to get the dust off it. He showed her how to set the pail and how to settle her shoulder against the warm flank of the animal and how to find the rhythm. He let her try. The first squeeze produced nothing. The second produced nothing. The third produced a thin, pale stream that hit the inside of the pail with a sound like rain on a tin roof. And Adelaide Thornberry laughed out loud for the first time in 5 years. It was a small sound, surprised, delighted, the sound of a woman who had not expected to be capable of anything new ever again. Wyatt Ashford was standing 2 feet behind her with his arms folded across his chest. And when she laughed, his face did something that none of his brothers would have been there to see if they had been in the barn at that moment. His mouth turned up just slightly at one corner. His eyes softened. "You have a gift for it," he said quietly. "I have a willingness," she said. "There is a difference." "There is," he said, "but the willingness is the harder of the two to come by, Miss Thornberry." She did not look up at him. She kept her cheek against the warm flank of the cow, and she kept milking, and she did not let him see her face because she knew that if she did, he would see what his words had done to her. But Wyatt Ashford had eyes that had been reading weather and tracks and animals all his life, and he saw it anyway. And he turned without another word and walked out of the barn into the snow. because he understood that there were moments when the kindest thing a man could do was leave a woman alone with her own surprised heart. Ezra was the hardest of the three brothers. He did not soften the way Crawford had softened in the first week. He did not unbend the way Wyatt had begun very slowly to unbend. He stayed careful with her. He stayed watchful. She did not push him. Her mother had taught her long ago that some hearts had to come to the door themselves, and that no amount of knocking from the outside would do anything but make them bolt. So she waited. It was on the evening of her 19th day that the door finally cracked open. She had been sitting by the hearth after supper with one of Crawford's shirts in her lap, mending a tear at the elbow, when Ezra came in from the cold with an armful of books. She had not known there were books in the cabin. He set them down on the table with a soft thump, and he stood there for a moment with his back to her, and then he turned and looked at her. "Miss Thornberry," he said. "Yes. Crawford says you can read. I can." Ezra looked down at the books on the table. They were three. One was a small, worn Bible with the cover coming loose from the spine. One was a battered almanac from 4 years ago. One was a thicker book bound in dark green cloth, the kind of book a person had to have meant to bring with them, the kind of book that did not end up on a mountain in Montana by accident. "These were our mother's," he said. Adelaide set down her mending. "She left them," Ezra said. "When she went, she left a great many things, but these she left on purpose, I think. She left them on the small shelf by the door. I have kept them on that shelf for 17 years. Adelaide was very quiet. "I can read some," Ezra said. He was looking down at the books and not at her. "Wyatt taught me my letters when I was little. He tried his best, but he did not have much himself. So I know the easy words. I can read a label on a tin. I can read a notice on a wall. But this," he laid his hand on the green book, "this I have never been able to read. I have tried. I have sat by the hearth at night with this book in my lap for years, and I have stared at the words, and they will not come together for me." He paused. "I do not know why I am telling you this." He stopped. His face was beginning to color along the high points of his cheekbones. Adelaide rose from her chair beside the hearth. She walked across the boards to the table. She did not touch the books. She put her hand on the bench beside them lightly, and she looked up at the youngest Ashford brother, and she spoke very quietly. "Mr. Ashford," she said, "Ezra, Ezra, may I sit with you here in the evenings after supper and read to you from your mother's book? And then if you wish it, we can take the words apart together slowly until they begin to come together for you. There is no shame in not having had a teacher. The shame is only ever in those who had teachers and learned nothing." Ezra Ashford was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than she had ever heard it. "I would like that, Miss Thornberry." Adelaide was on Adelaide. He sat down at the bench. She sat down beside him, leaving a careful space between them. She drew the green cloth book toward her, and she opened it, and the spine cracked softly, the way the spine of a book cracks when it has not been opened for a long time and is grateful to be opened again. She turned to the first page. It was a book of poems. She smiled when she saw it. "Your mother loved poetry," she said. "I do not know." Ezra said, "I do not remember her well enough to know what she loved." Adelaide nodded. "Then I will tell you what she loved," she said. "She loved the kind of words that say more than they mean. She loved a writer named Wordsworth. She loved a writer named Longfellow. There is a poem in here by Mr. Longfellow that I think she may have known by heart. May I read it to you?" Yes, she read. She read in a voice that had been taught to read aloud in the parlor of a Boston house with green damask curtains in front of a father who had loved to listen, and the words of the dead poet rose up into the rafters of the cabin on Bitterroot Ridge and filled the warm air around the hearth with a sound that the cabin had never heard in its 40 years of standing. Crawford, who had been at the stove cleaning a coffee pot, set the pot down and stood very still. Wyatt, who had been at the workbench by the door oiling his rifle, laid the rag aside and did not move. Copper rose from his place by the fire and walked across the room and laid his big golden head on Ezra Ashford's knee. Ezra did not look down at the two. Ezra was staring at the page in front of Adelaide as though he could see for the first time in his life the shape of the country that lay on the other side of the words. When she finished the poem, the cabin was silent. She closed the book gently and laid her hands on top of it. Ezra did not look up. "She is in there," he said, after a moment. His voice was very low. "My mother. She is in those words. I can hear her in them." "Yes," Adelaide said. "I think she is." The youngest Ashford brother put his big rough hand flat on the cover of the book between them, and he kept it there for a long time. Then he raised his head and he looked at Adelaide Thornberry, and his amber eyes were wet and unashamed of being wet, and he said the only thing he had it in him to say. "Thank you," he said. "You are welcome," she said. Behind them by the workbench, Wyatt Ashford laid down the rifle he had been pretending to oil, and he turned and walked out the back door of the cabin into the winter night without his coat, and he did not come back in for almost a quarter of an hour. When he did come back in, his eyes were red around the rims, and he did not look at anyone, and he went to the hearth and added a log to the fire, and stood with his back to the room until he had himself in hand again. That night, when she lay down on the narrow bed in the small room Wyatt had given her on her first morning, the room with the bolt on the inside of the door, and pulled the buffalo robe up to her chin, she heard a sound she had not heard in any of the 18 nights before it. She heard Ezra Ashford out in the barn loft above the horses, where the three brothers had been sleeping all winter, crying very quietly into the rough wool of his blanket. The sound carried on the still, cold air, the way sound carries on a winter night when there is nothing else moving in the world. He was not crying loud. He was only crying the way a young man cries when something has finally broken open inside him, after a long time of being held shut, and the sound of it was not a sad sound. It was a sound of release. Copper, who had refused from the first night to sleep anywhere but on the floor at the foot of her bed, lifted his head and listened for a moment. Then he laid his head back down and sighed a long, deep sigh. Adelaide closed her eyes. She had been on Bitterroot Ridge for 19 days. She had set a table. She had milked a cow. She had read a poem aloud to a young man who had been waiting most of his life to hear his mother's voice come back to him. But for the first time since she had left Boston, Adelaide Thornberry fell asleep in a house and did not dream of running. Outside, far down the mountain in the lamp-lit back room of the saloon in Silver Creek, 4 men were being paid in gold coin by a man with a heavy watch chain across his vest. The men were rough. They were the kind of men who had made their livings on the wrong side of the law for so long that they no longer remembered what side they had started on. The man with the watch chain was telling them where to ride and when to ride and what to bring back with them when they came. He was telling them about a cabin on a ridge. He was telling them about 3 brothers and a wife. He was telling them about a young woman with honey-colored hair who was carrying a small leather-bound book that he wanted very badly to see burned to ash in front of his own eyes before the next moon was full. The 4 men listened. They counted the gold. They nodded. Outside the saloon, a thin new snow had begun to fall on the streets of Silver Creek, and in the high country above the timberline, the wind was beginning to rise again, and the long winter was not yet half over. Crawford did not mean to find it. That was the way these things always happen on the mountain. The most important moments came not when a man went looking for them, but when he was minding some small task and the world reached up and put a thing into his hands that he had no choice but to hold. It was the morning of Adelaide's 23rd day on Bitterroot Ridge. The sky had broken open at dawn into one of those high, clear winter days that the mountain gives sometimes after a long stretch of storm. Days so cold the breath cracks in the air. Days so bright the snow throws back the sun until a man squints to look at it. Adelaide had gone down to the creek with Copper to wash linens in the way Crawford had taught her, breaking the ice with the back of an axe and rinsing the cloth in the running water beneath. Wyatt was out with the sheep. Ezra was up on the south slope cutting timber. Crawford had been alone in the cabin, sweeping the floor of the small back bedroom. because she had asked him the night before if he might help her shake out the buffalo robe and air it. He had taken the robe outside. He had come back in. He had bent to lift the small leather trunk away from the wall so that he could sweep behind it, and the trunk had been heavier on one side than the other. And the lock that had held it shut all these weeks had finally given way under the strain of the cold and the shifting and the long journey, and the lid had fallen open against his knee, and the contents had spilled across the floorboards. Crawford froze. He did not touch any of it. He stood very still and looked down at what had come out of the trunk. A folded dress the color of old roses, a small pouch that held a child's hair ribbon and a dried sprig of rosemary. A worn leather Bible with a slip of paper sticking out of the back pages, and under all of it, half wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, the leather-bound ledger that had been on the small, three-legged table beside her bed since the morning Wyatt had put it there. Except now the ledger was open. It had fallen open when the trunk had spilled, and the page it had opened to was the first page, and the first page held a name written across the top in the same careful, neat handwriting that Crawford recognized the way a man recognizes any handwriting he has seen on a tombstone he has helped to dig. The name was Cassius Blackwood. Beneath it were columns of numbers and dates and other names, and one word at the bottom of the page underlined twice, in a hand that had been pressing hard enough to nearly tear through the paper. Fraud. Crawford did not pick up the ledger. He did not read further. He understood in the way that good men sometimes understand a thing all at once, that what he was looking at belonged to a story he was not yet meant to read. He knelt and he gathered the dress and the pouch and the Bible back into the trunk with the gentleness of a man returning sacred objects to an altar. He closed the ledger without turning another page, and he laid it on top of the other things. He shut the trunk and he set it back against the wall in exactly the place it had been. Then he went out into the yard and he stood in the snow with his hands at his sides, and he waited for his older brother to come back from the sheep. Wyatt came in an hour later. Crawford was still standing in the same place. Wyatt looked at him once and knew. "What is it?" Wyatt said. "We need to talk." Crawford said, "All three of us, tonight, after supper." That evening, after Adelaide had gone to her room and the door was bolted from the inside, the three Ashford brothers sat at the long pine table in the lamplight, and Crawford told his older brother and his younger brother what he had seen. He told it the way he told everything, plain, no more than the words required. When he was done, Wyatt sat very still for a long moment. "Cassius Blackwood," Wyatt said. Crawford nodded. Ezra spoke. "The man who runs Silver Creek. The man who has been trying to buy our south pasture for 2 years. The man who sent his hired hand up here last September with that offer and that smile that made my skin crawl. The same man," Crawford said. Wyatt looked down at his hands on the table. He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke at last, his voice was the voice of a man putting pieces together that he had not known were the same puzzle. "Her father," he said, "Nathaniel Thornberry, the bookkeeper. She told me her father had died in Montana 5 years ago. She did not tell me where. She did not tell me how. But the year matches, and the country matches. And if Cassius Blackwood is in that ledger of hers, then the rest writes itself." He raised his eyes to his brothers. "She has been carrying that book for 5 years," he said. "She crossed 2,000 miles of country with it inside her dress. She walked up our mountain in a blizzard rather than let it go. She came here because of him. The advertisement was the way in. Bitterroot Ridge is a day's ride from Silver Creek, and I never thought a thing of it. I thought she had answered me because she was alone and frightened. She was. But she was also brave in a way I did not understand until just now." Ezra leaned forward. "So we say nothing. We say nothing tonight," Wyatt said. "She will tell us when she is ready. A woman who has carried a thing like that alone for 5 years has earned the right to choose her hour. But she does not have to carry it alone anymore," Crawford said quietly. "No," Wyatt said, "she does not. The hour came 2 nights later. It came because of the wolves. The bitter cold of the clear days had pushed the game down out of the high country, and where the game went, the wolves followed. And on the night of Adelaide's 25th day on Bitterroot Ridge, a hunting pack came down off the ridge above the cabin and went for the sheep in the small fenced pen behind the barn. Wyatt heard them first. He had been sitting at the table mending a bridle, and his head came up at the sound of copper rising from the hearth with his hackles already lifting along his spine. Then the first wolf cry tore through the cold air outside close enough that the lamp shook on the table, Sheep Wyatt said. He was already reaching for his rifle. Ezra grabbed his own from the pegs by the door. Crawford grabbed the shotgun. The three brothers were out the door in less than 10 seconds, Copper running ahead of them with that low, silent speed that good dogs find when there is real work to be done. The cabin door slammed shut behind them. Adelaide, who had been at the table reading from the green poetry book to Ezra not 5 minutes earlier, was alone in the cabin. She rose from her chair. She crossed to the window. She could see by the light of the half moon in the snow throwing back its glow, the dark shapes moving in the pen behind the barn, and the larger shapes of the three brothers, running with their guns raised and Copper streaking ahead of them like a piece of golden firelight. Then she heard the sound behind her. It was the smallest sound, the scrape of a paw on wood, the hiss of breath that was not human. She turned slowly and she saw in the open doorway that the brothers had not had time to pull all the way shut behind them. The long, lean shape of a wolf that had broken from the pack, encircled wide, and come up on the cabin from the blind side. It was inside the room with her. Adelaide did not scream. She did not run. Some part of her that had been forged in 4 weeks of trains and stagecoaches, in a long climb up a mountain in a blizzard, had become a thing that did not waste time on screaming. Her eyes went to the rack by the door where the second shotgun hung. Her body moved before her mind had finished the thought. She got to the gun, she pulled it down. She had never fired this one before, but she had fired the other one with Crawford in the meadow behind the barn, and Ezra had told her that the action was the same. She broke the breech the way Crawford had shown her. There were 2 shells in it. She snapped it shut. The wolf came for her. It came low and fast across the floorboards, and Adelaide had time to register only that it was bigger than she had thought, and that its eyes were yellow, and that its mouth was open. She brought the shotgun up to her shoulder, and she pointed it the way she had been taught, and she pulled the trigger. The recoil knocked her backward into the wall. The wolf went down, but it was not alone. It had not come into the cabin alone. Copper, who had turned at the first sound she could not hear from outside the cabin, and had come running back across the snow, because his nose had told him the danger was no longer in the sheep pen, came through the door at a full charge and met the second wolf as it leapt for Adelaide from the doorway. She did not see it clearly. She saw a tangle of gold and gray. She heard a sound that no living thing should ever have to make. She raised the shotgun a second time, and she waited until she had a clear shot, and she fired the second barrel into the gray shape, and the gray shape stopped moving. Copper was on the floor. He was bleeding. He was bleeding from his shoulder and from his flank, where the second wolf had got him with its teeth before he had gotten it with his. He was trying to stand. He was failing. Adelaide dropped the shotgun and went to her knees beside him on the bloody floorboards, and she did the only thing she could think to do, which was to press her small hands against the worst of the bleeding and to talk to him in a voice she did not know she had. "Stay with me," she was saying. "Copper, stay with me. You stay with me. You hear me. You stay." That was how the brothers found her when they came through the door 3 minutes later, breathless from running the sheep saved and the rest of the pack driven back into the timber. They found Adelaide Thornberry kneeling on the floor of the cabin in a pool of blood, with both her hands pressed to the side of a golden retriever who was still barely breathing. And they found 2 dead wolves in the corner, and they found a shotgun lying on the floor beside her with both barrels spent. Wyatt did not say a word. He crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees on the other side of the dog and put his big hands over hers. Crawford was already reaching for the small wooden box in which he kept the needles and the catgut thread and the blue glass bottle of carbolic acid that he had paid $5 for in Silver Creek the summer before because he had a feeling that someday someone in the family was going to need it. They worked through the night. Crawford was the surgeon. He had patched up horses and steers in his own brothers more times than he could count, and he had a steadiness in his hands that Adelaide did not know to be grateful for until she watched him use it. Wyatt held the dog. Ezra held the lamp. Adelaide held Copper's great golden head in her lap and stroked his ears and whispered to him in a voice so low that none of the brothers could hear what she was saying. Copper's eyes were closed, but his tail moved once very faintly when she touched him. Toward dawn, Crawford sat back on his heels and wiped his bloody hands on a rag and looked across the dog at his older brother. "He will live," Crawford said quietly. "The wound on the shoulder is bad, but it is clean. The flank is worse, but I have got it sewn. He has lost a great deal of blood. He will be weak for a long while, but if the fever does not come, he will live." Wyatt nodded. Then he looked at Adelaide. Her face was streaked with blood and tears, and her hands were shaking, and her honey-colored hair had come loose from its pins and was hanging around her face in tangled waves. She did not look like a Boston girl anymore. She looked like a woman who had killed 2 wolves with a borrowed shotgun in defense of a household that had 3 weeks ago not even known her name. Wyatt Ashford got up from the floor. He came around the dog. He knelt in front of her, and he took her trembling, bloody hands in his, and he held them. "Adelaide Thornberry," he said, "yes, you saved my dog. You saved this house. I do not know what I have done in my life to deserve a woman walking up this mountain in a blizzard to find us, but whatever it was, I am thankful for it. I am thankful for it every hour of every day for the rest of my life." She broke then. She had not broken in the snow. She had not broken when the shotgun had recoiled into her shoulder. She had not broken when the wolf had come for her in the doorway. But she broke now, kneeling in the blood of a dog she loved more than she had thought it was possible to love a creature she had known for 3 weeks, with the great calloused hands of Wyatt Ashford holding hers and his amber eyes saying the thing his mouth was not yet ready to say. She wept. He held her hands until she was done. He did not pull her into him because he understood that a woman who has just killed 2 wolves needs to be held only on her own terms. But when at last she lifted her face and looked at him through the wet hair and the streaks of blood, he raised one of her hands very slowly and pressed it for one quiet moment against his own bearded cheek. Then he let her go. Crawford was watching. Ezra was watching. Copper somehow, with the last of his strength, lifted his head 1/2 inch off her lap and laid it back down with a sigh that meant he understood that everyone in his family was alive, and he could rest now. It was Adelaide who spoke first. "I have to tell you something," she said. "All 3 of you, I have to tell you tonight. I have been a coward about it for too long." Wyatt looked at her. "You do not have to tell us anything," he said gently. "Not tonight, not ever if you do not wish to." "I do wish to," she said, "because I owe it to you. And because if those wolves had been men instead of wolves, the next ones who come might be." The brothers grew very still. She told them then. She told them about Nathaniel Thornberry and the green glass lamp on Beacon Hill. She told them about the letter from the mining concern in Montana Territory. She told them about the telegram that had come 3 months later and the way her mother had gone upstairs and never really come down. She told them about the 4 years in her uncle's house and the night she had found her father's hidden letter in the back of his Bible and the leather-bound ledger in the false bottom of the cedar trunk in the attic. She told them about the columns of stolen gold and the names of ruined men and the word fraud underlined twice in her father's careful hand. She told them about Cassius Blackwood. She told them about the matrimonial advertisement in the newspaper and the moment she had realized that Bitterroot Ridge was a day's ride from Silver Creek, and the cold, practical decision she had made to use a stranger's loneliness as the cover for her own purpose. When she got to that part, her voice broke. "I did not come here for you," she said to Wyatt. "Not at first. I came here for him. I came here to find a way to make him pay for what he did to my father, and I thought a mountain rancher with no family ties was the safest door I could walk through to get to him without being seen. I lied to you. By coming here under false pretenses, I lied to you. And then I let you put a bolt on a door for me, and I let your brothers feed me and teach me to milk a cow, and I let myself feel safe in your house. And the whole time I was carrying that book hidden in my trunk, and I never said a word. She stopped. She could not look at him. I am sorry, she said. I will go in the spring. I will not hold you to anything. You owe me nothing. You have given me more than I had any right to ask for, and I have lied to you in return. The cabin was very quiet. It was Ezra who spoke first. The youngest brother, the one she had been most afraid would judge her, the one whose mother had walked away from him on a summer morning when he was 8 years old. Miss Adelaide, Ezra said. She made herself look at him. You did not lie to us, he said. You did not tell us all of who you were when you got here. There is a difference. A woman alone in this country with the kind of secret you are carrying does not owe the truth to the first three strange men she meets. She owes it to the ones who earn it. And we have earned it now, and you have given it to us, and that is the only kind of telling that ever mattered. Crawford spoke next. We knew, he said simply. She turned her head sharply. The lock on your trunk gave way 2 days ago when I was sweeping behind it, Crawford said. The lid fell open. I saw the first page of the ledger. I did not read it. I did not need to. I saw his name and I closed the book and I put everything back. I told my brothers that night. We have known for 2 days and we agreed to wait until you were ready to tell us yourself. Adelaide stared at him. Wyatt was the last to speak. I do not care why you came, he said. I care that you are here. I care from the night you walked up that mountain in the storm carrying a book heavier than your own life. Whatever made you brave enough to do that is the same thing that has been changing this house for 3 weeks and is going to keep changing it for a long time yet if you will let it. I am not going to let you ride down off this mountain in the spring to face Cassius Blackwood alone. None of us are. You came here looking for justice for your father. You found a family that is going to help you get it. He paused. A man keeps his word, Adelaide, and that is my word. She wept again. But the weeping this time was different. The weeping this time was the weeping of a person who has set down a burden she has carried so long that she has forgotten what her own back felt like without it. They came 8 days later. Copper had begun to walk again on his 3rd day, slow and careful, his shoulder bandaged. The brothers had taken turns keeping watch at night because Wyatt had said from the moment of Adelaide's confession that they should expect company. Ezra had gone out each morning and walked the perimeter of the homestead in widening circles, reading the snow for tracks, the way other men read books. On the morning of the 8th day, he came back into the cabin with his face set hard. 4 riders, he said, 2 miles out, coming up the south draw. They are not here for tea. Wyatt was already reaching for his rifle. The brothers had time. The riders were coming up a slope that no horse could climb at speed in deep snow. The brothers had perhaps 20 minutes to make ready. Wyatt put Adelaide in the small back bedroom with a loaded shotgun across her lap and Copper at her feet. And he told her in a voice that did not allow argument that she was to bolt the door and not open it for anyone whose voice she did not know. Then the 3 brothers took up their positions. Crawford took the loft window with the long rifle. Ezra took the corner of the barn with the 2nd rifle. Wyatt took the front door with his Colt and the shotgun because Wyatt was the biggest of the 3, and Wyatt would be the one the riders came for first. They came at a walk, 4 men on tired horses, their faces wrapped against the cold, their hands on their gun butts. They stopped 50 yards from the cabin. Hello, the house, the lead rider called. Wyatt did not answer. We are looking for a woman, the lead rider called. Boston woman, yellow hair. We have business with her. Hand her over and there will be no trouble for you boys. Wyatt stepped out onto the porch. Turn your horses around, he said, his voice carried in the cold air. There is no woman here for you. There is no business for you here. Ride down off this mountain and tell the man who sent you that the next time he wants to pay men in gold to come up to my place in the dark, he should pay them more because the price for what he is asking is going to be very high." The lead rider laughed. He should not have laughed. What followed was over very quickly. It was over very quickly because Crawford Ashford was the best long shot in 3 counties, and he had been waiting in the loft window with that long rifle steady on a sandbag for 15 minutes. The lead rider went out of his saddle before his laugh had finished. The second rider went down before he had cleared his pistol from its holster. The third rider got off one shot, which went wide before Ezra's rifle from the corner of the barn took him out of the fight. The fourth rider tried to run. He turned his horse and put spurs to it and got perhaps 30 yards down the trail before the horse caught a hidden root and went down hard and threw him into a snowbank. He came up out of the snow with his pistol in his hand and a wild look in his eye, and he saw Wyatt Ashford coming for him on foot across the open ground, and he aimed. He never got the shot off, but he got close. He got close enough that when Wyatt's bullet took him down, Ezra Ashford, who had moved out of his cover at the corner of the barn to flank the rider in case he ran the other way, was caught in the open by a wild round. The man had fired half a second before he died. Ezra went down in the snow. Wyatt did not see it for 3 full seconds. Then Crawford was screaming his name from the loft window, and Wyatt was running, and the world was very far away and very small all at once. Ezra was alive. He was alive, but the wound was high in his thigh, and it was bleeding, the kind of bleeding that does not stop on its own. Wyatt got him into the cabin. Crawford was already there, his face white. Adelaide had unbolted the door at the sound of her name being shouted and had taken one look at the youngest brother in his older brother's arms and had moved to clear the long pine table without being told. They laid Ezra on the table. Crawford worked on him for nearly an hour. He stopped the worst of the bleeding. He cleaned the wound with a carbolic acid. He bound it. When he was done, he stepped back and his hands were shaking. "The bullet is still in there," he said. "I cannot get it out without tools I do not have. And the wound is going to fever. I have seen this kind of wound before. He needs medicine I do not have. The kind they keep in the apothecary in Silver Creek." Wyatt looked at the window. The light was already going. The wind was rising. A new storm was coming in off the high country. "I will go," he said. Crawford did not argue. There was no one else who could go. Crawford had to stay to keep watch over Ezra and to keep watch in case Cassius Blackwood sent another rider up the mountain when these 4 did not return. Adelaide moved to him as he was pulling on his heaviest coat. "Wyatt," she said, "you cannot ride through this. The pass is going to close." "You cannot. I am going," he said. She put her small hands flat against his chest. She looked up at him. Her eyes were the color of cornflowers in a spring meadow back east, and there were tears in them, but her voice when it came was steady. "Then come back to me," she said. He looked down at her for a long moment. He raised one big calloused hand and touched her cheek with the back of his fingers very lightly, the way a man touches a thing he is afraid to break. "Adelaide Thornberry," he said, "I am going to ride down this mountain. I am going to get the medicine my brother needs. And I am going to come back to this cabin and to you because somewhere in the last 4 weeks, you became the reason I want to see the sun come up in the morning, and I am not going to die in a snowdrift before I have told you that to your face in the daylight. Do you hear me? I am coming back." He did not kiss her. There was not time, and he was not the kind of man who would have, even if there had been. He pressed his forehead against hers for one short breath, and then he turned and went out the door into the rising storm. Adelaide stood at the window and watched him until the snow took him. For 2 days and 2 nights, she did not sleep more than an hour at a stretch. She sat by Ezra's bed and changed the cool cloths on his forehead and held his hand when the fever made him dream and pray to a mother who had walked away from him 17 years ago. She helped Crawford change the dressings on the wound. She cooked broth that no one ate. She prayed in a way she had not prayed since she was a child, Not the rote prayers of her uncle's joyless household, but the broken, honest prayers of a woman who had finally found something worth begging God to keep for her. On the third night, very late, Copper rose from his place by the hearth and walked stiffly to the door and laid his big golden head against it and whined. Adelaide was on her feet before the sound had finished. She unbolted the door. She pulled it open. The storm had finally broken. The snow had stopped. The sky was beginning to clear in the east, and against the gray dawn, she saw a single horse coming up the last rise of the trail with a great bent figure in the saddle. Wyatt Ashford rode into the yard. He was barely conscious. There was ice in his beard and frost on his eyebrows, and his hands inside the gloves were so cold that Crawford had to pry them open one finger at a time to take the small wrapped bundle of medicine out of them. Wyatt fell out of the saddle into Crawford's arms. Adelaide was there. Adelaide caught his other side. Together they got him into the cabin and laid him by the fire, and Crawford ran with the medicine to Ezra. The ride had nearly killed Wyatt Ashford. But the medicine got to Ezra in time, and within 12 hours the fever began to break, and within 2 days the youngest Ashford brother opened his amber eyes and croaked for water. It was Adelaide who brought it to him. Wyatt slept for almost a full day after he came in. When he woke, Adelaide was sitting in a chair beside him, with her hand resting on his and her honey-colored hair coming loose around her face and her eyes red from not sleeping. He looked up at her without speaking. She looked down at him. Then she laid her cheek against the back of his great calloused hand, and she closed her eyes, and she stayed there for a long time. And neither of them needed to say a single word because everything that needed to be said was already in the room with them, the way the warmth of a fire is in a room without anyone having to point at it. The past cleared in March. By the time it did, the 4 men in the snow at the bottom of the South Draw had been buried by Crawford and Wyatt, and a careful set of lies had been prepared for Silver Creek if anyone came asking. No one did. Cassius Blackwood was waiting. Cassius Blackwood was hunting. But Cassius Blackwood was about to learn that he had hunted the wrong family. They rode down to Silver Creek on a clear, cold morning in the second week of March. Wyatt and Crawford and Ezra, with his legs still stiff but his back straight in the saddle, and Adelaide riding the gentle bay mare that Wyatt had taught her to handle through the long, quiet weeks of February. Copper trotted alongside them slower now than he had been before the wolves, but stubborn, refusing to be left behind. Adelaide carried the leather-bound ledger inside her coat against her ribs, the way she had carried it up the mountain 4 months earlier, and she carried something else inside her coat as well, a small silver locket that she had not had when she came. It was her father's locket. She had not known it still existed. They had found it in the pocket of the Lead Rider on the morning after the gunfight when Crawford had gone through the dead men's belongings before the burying. It had been engraved on the back with the initials N.T. and the words, "With all my love, Charlotte." It was the locket Nathaniel Thornberry had been wearing the day he had died on a mountain trail above Silver Creek 5 years earlier. The man who had killed him had taken it as a trophy. The man who had killed him had been one of the 4 riders sent to kill her, and the locket had still been on him 5 years later. And now it was around Adelaide Thornberry's own neck, and she touched it, sometimes the way other people touched a cross. They did not go to the sheriff in Silver Creek. The sheriff in Silver Creek was Cassius Blackwood's man, and they knew it. They went instead to the small federal courthouse at the edge of town where a circuit judge held court once a month, and they asked for the United States Marshal who had been newly assigned to the district that winter. The clerk took their names. The clerk went to the back room. The clerk came back with the marshal. The marshal stopped in the doorway when he saw Wyatt Ashford. He was a big man, not as big as Wyatt, but big. He had the same hard square jaw and the same quiet weight and the same amber eyes, and his dark hair had a thread of early gray running through it at the temples that Wyatt's did not yet have. Wyatt stared at him for a full 10 seconds without speaking. Then he said one word very softly, "Beau." The marshal closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. "Brother," he said. Beauregard Ashford had not seen his older brother in 9 years. He had been a boy of 18 the night of the fight that had driven him off the mountain, the fight about their father and the way he had drunk himself to death, and whose fault that had been, and whose fault it had not been. He had ridden away into the dark, and Wyatt had not followed him because Wyatt had had two younger boys to raise and no time for chasing a half-brother who had made his choice. Bo had gone east. Bo had read law in a small town in Iowa. Bo had pinned on a deputy marshal's star, and then a marshal's star, and 3 years ago he had begun to hear stories about a mining man in Montana Territory named Cassius Blackwood, and Bo Ashford had requested the assignment to the district that contained Silver Creek, and he had been quietly building a case against Blackwood ever since, a case that had never quite had enough proof to bring before a federal grand jury. Until now, Wyatt and Beauregard Ashford embraced in the doorway of the federal courthouse, and neither of them was ashamed of the way they held each other or of the wetness on their faces. Crawford and Ezra stood back and watched their older brother and their other brother find each other after 9 years of silence, and Crawford looked at Ezra, and Ezra looked at Crawford, and neither of them said anything because some things do not need words. Then Wyatt drew back and turned and gestured to Adelaide, who had been standing very quietly by the clerk's desk. "Bo," he said, "this is Adelaide Thornberry. She came up our mountain in a blizzard in December carrying a book that you have been waiting 5 years to read." "Adelaide, this is my brother, the marshal you have been looking for." Adelaide stepped forward. She drew the leather-bound ledger out of her coat. She held it out to Beauregard Ashford with both hands. "This belonged to my father," she said. "His name was Nathaniel Thornberry. He was murdered 5 years ago by a man named Cassius Blackwood. Everything you need is in this book." Bo Ashford took the ledger. His big hands were shaking. It happened on a Sunday morning. They had decided after 2 days of planning with Bo, and after Bo had read the ledger from cover to cover and had nearly wept at the precision of Nathaniel Thornberry's bookkeeping, that the cleanest way to take Cassius Blackwood was in front of the entire town, in a place where his hired guns could not save him. The cleanest place for that was the small white clapboard church at the head of Silver Creek's Main Street, where every soul in town who had any pretense of respectability gathered every Sunday morning to hear the visiting preacher. Cassius Blackwood always sat in the front pew. It was his pew. He had paid for the church to be built. That Sunday morning, the congregation was settling in and the preacher was opening his Bible when the heavy oak doors at the back of the church swung open. Adelaide Thornberry walked in first. She was wearing the navy traveling dress she had worn on the night she had walked up Bitterroot Ridge in the storm, the dress Crawford had cleaned and mended for her over the long, quiet weeks of January. Her honey-colored hair was pinned up beneath a small hat. The cameo brooch was at her throat. The silver locket was around her neck. She walked down the center aisle of the church with her head high and her hands at her sides, and the leather-bound ledger held against her chest, and behind her walked the 4 Ashford brothers, Wyatt and Crawford and Ezra and Beauregard, with the federal star bright on his coat, and Copper walked at Adelaide's left hand the way he had walked beside her all winter, his great golden head almost level with her elbow. The congregation went silent. Cassius Blackwood turned in his front pew and looked down the aisle and went the color of old paper. Adelaide stopped in front of the altar. She turned to face the people of Silver Creek. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The church was so quiet that the small sounds of children breathing could be heard in the back rows. "My name is Adelaide Thornberry," she said. "My father was Nathaniel Thornberry. 5 years ago, he came to your town as a bookkeeper for a mining company owned by a man who was sitting in the front pew of this church. He found that the man was a thief. He was going to bring the proof to the territorial authorities. Before he could, the man had him killed and made it look like a riding accident. I have his ledger here. I have the names of the miners this man has robbed for 7 years. I have the dates and the amounts. I have my father's own handwriting. And I have a United States Marshal standing behind me who has been waiting 5 years for this evidence." She turned. She looked at Bo. Beauregard Ashford stepped forward. He drew a folded warrant from inside his coat and he held it up for the congregation to see. Cassius Blackwood, he said, by the authority of the federal court of the Montana Territory, you are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and the murder of Nathaniel Thornberry. Blackwood moved fast. He was old, but he was not slow, and he had been waiting for this kind of moment long enough that he had practiced for it. He came up out of the front pew with a small pistol in his hand, and he turned not toward the marshal, but toward Adelaide, because he understood that the woman with the ledger was the only thing in the room that mattered. He got 2 steps toward her before he realized that he had a problem. The problem was a golden retriever. Copper had been walking at Adelaide's left hand. Copper had seen Cassius Blackwood's hand come up out of his coat with the pistol in it. Copper had not waited for any human being to tell him what to do, because Copper had been waiting his whole long, patient, golden life for one moment, when his family would need him to be more than and this was the moment, and Copper knew it. The old golden retriever with his stiff shoulder and his bandaged flank and his graying muzzle crossed the space between Adelaide and Cassius Blackwood in a single low silent leap and took the man's gun arm in his teeth before the pistol could come level. The pistol fired into the floor of the church. Wyatt Ashford was on Blackwood half a heartbeat later. The fight, if it could be called a fight, lasted perhaps 3 seconds. When it was over, Cassius Blackwood was face down on the floor of the church he had built with Wyatt Ashford's knee in the small of his back, and Bo Ashford's handcuffs going onto his wrists. And Copper was standing in the aisle with the front of his golden coat dark with the man's blood. And Adelaide Thornberry had not moved an inch from where she had been standing. The church erupted. The miners stood. The widows stood. The men whose brothers had died in Blackwood's salted claims, and the women whose husbands had come home from his crooked assay, scales with empty pockets and broken hopes, all of them stood, and the sound that came up out of them was not a cheer, but something deeper than a cheer, something that had been waiting in the throats of Silver Creek for 7 years and was finally being let out. Beauregard Ashford had to draw his service revolver and stand over Blackwood to keep the crowd from getting to him. He needed Blackwood alive. He needed him to stand trial. And so the federal marshal, who had spent 5 years building a case in his quiet, careful way, protected the man he had hated longest until he could get him out of the church and into the jail at the back of the federal courthouse and on the next stagecoach east to Helena to face a grand jury. Adelaide Thornberry stood in the front of the church and watched it all and did not weep until she felt a small, wet nose press against her hand. Copper. Bloody and tired, and standing on 3 legs because the leap had reopened the wound in his flank. She knelt in the aisle and gathered him into her arms and pressed her face into his golden fur and wept the way she had not wept since she had been a child in her father's arms. Wyatt Ashford came and knelt beside her, and he put one big calloused hand on her shoulder, and she leaned into him without lifting her face from the bum, and the 4 Ashford brothers and the woman from Boston and the old golden retriever stayed that way for a long time in the front of a church in a town that had just been given back its honor. And outside the open doors of the church, the mountain wind was beginning to soften the way it does in the very last week of winter, when something old and cold is finally letting go and something new is finally about to come. They were married in May. They were married under the big pine tree behind the cabin, in the place where Wyatt had buried Lenore and Cordelia 5 winters earlier, because Wyatt had said quietly to Adelaide on the morning of their engagement that the place where his first family was buried was the only place holy enough for him to take a second wife, and Adelaide had understood without having to ask. The visiting preacher came up from Silver Creek. Crawford gave the bride away because her father could not. Ezra was the best man, his leg almost fully healed. Beauregard rode up from Helena for the ceremony with his federal star polished bright. Copper wore a blue ribbon around his neck that Adelaide had tied there herself. Adelaide wore the navy traveling dress she had worn the night she had come up the mountain in the storm. It seemed to her the only dress in the world that was right for the occasion. She had washed it and pressed it and pinned the cameo at her throat and the silver locket beside it. And when she walked up the small grass aisle that Crawford had cut through the wildflowers behind the cabin, Wyatt Ashford turned and looked at her, and his amber eyes filled the way the eyes of a man fill when he understands all at once that the worst winter of his life was the road that had been bringing him to the best spring. He took her hand. He spoke his vows in the steady, plain way he spoke everything. Adelaide Thornberry, he said, you came to my door in a storm, and I thought I was opening it to a stranger. I was opening it to my whole life. I promise to love you as long as I have breath in me, and to keep you safe for as long as my hands work, and to remember every morning that you walked 2,000 miles in the cold to find me. A man keeps his word, and this is the most important word I will ever keep. She wept through the whole thing. She did not try to stop. The whole gathering wept with her. Even Copper sighed the deep, contented sigh of a who has finally understood what all the work of the long winter had been for. 25 years passed. They passed the way the years pass on a mountain, slowly at first, and then all at once, marked by the turning of the seasons, in the births of children, in the small accumulations of a life built by the hands of two people who had decided they were going to build it together. The cabin grew. Wyatt added a new room the first summer and another the second, and by the time the first child came in the winter of 1880, the place had 3 bedrooms and a parlor and a long pine kitchen with a window that looked out over the south pasture. The first child was a girl. They named her Lenora Cordelia because Adelaide had said to Wyatt one quiet evening that no woman ever had the right to ask a man to put away the love he had carried before her. And the only honest way to bring a child into a house that still held the memory of 2 souls who had gone before was to bring her in carrying their names. Wyatt had not been able to speak when she said it. He had only taken her hand and held it for a long time. The night Lenora Cordelia Ashford was born, her father held her in his great calloused hands, and he wept the kind of slow, steady tears that come out of a man who has been given back something he had given up forever. 3 more children followed. Nathaniel named for Adelaide's father, born in 1882. Charlotte named for her mother, born in 1885. And in 1889, a boy they named Wyatt Jr., who came into the world looking exactly like his father and who would grow up to be even taller. Crawford never married. He stayed on at the cabin and helped his older brother run the place and was the favorite uncle of all 4 of Wyatt and Adelaide's children, the one who taught them to play the harmonica and to read the weather in the high clouds and to be kind to animals, because the animals were always paying closer attention than people thought. Ezra met a young school teacher in Silver Creek in the spring of 1881. Her name was Winifred, and she had come west from Vermont to teach in the new school the federal government had built after Cassius Blackwood's empire had been broken up and the stolen money had been returned to the miners. Ezra courted her in his quiet, careful way for almost a year before he asked her to marry him. They built their own small place a quarter-mile down the ridge from the main cabin and raised 3 children of their own. Beauregard rode up from Helena 2 or 3 times a year to visit. He had married a widow with 2 boys of her own and had become the kind of marshal who was known throughout the territory for his fairness and his patience. Cassius Blackwood was tried in federal court in Helena in the summer of 1879. The trial lasted 4 days. Adelaide Thornberry Ashford testified on the second day with her husband, sitting in the front row of the courtroom, and her hand on the leather-bound ledger she had carried up a mountain in a blizzard to bring to that very moment. Blackwood was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to life in the federal penitentiary. He died there in 1884 alone, with no one to claim his body, and the men whose lives he had ruined lifted a quiet glass of whiskey at the saloon in Silver Creek when the news came down the wire. Copper lived another 7 years. He died in his sleep on a warm evening in September of 1886, lying on the porch of the cabin, with his graying muzzle on the toe of Wyatt Ashford's boot. Adelaide and Wyatt buried him under the big pine tree beside Lenora and Cordelia, because Copper had been a member of that family long before Adelaide had ever come up the mountain, and his place was with them. They got another golden retriever the next spring, a son of one of Copper's pups from a litter the old dog had sired in his middle years, and they named her Penny because her coat was the color of a new copper coin in the sunlight. Penny took up her duties without being told. The years went on. In the spring of 1903, on a quiet evening in the second week of May, 25 years after Adelaide Thornberry had walked up the mountain in the worst storm of her life, Wyatt and Adelaide Ashford sat together on the porch their hands had built and watched the sun go down over the Bitterroot Mountains. Wyatt was 58. His dark hair had gone the color of iron at the temples. His amber eyes had not changed. His big calloused hands had grown a little stiff in the cold months, but they still held a rifle steady, and they still held his wife's hand the way they had held it on the day they were married. Adelaide was 47. The honey color of her hair had begun to silver. The cornflower blue of her eyes had not. She wore the cameo brooch at her throat the way she had worn it all her life, and beside it on a thin chain she still wore the silver locket that had once belonged to her father. Penny lay at their feet, with her golden head on her paws. In the cabin behind them, the children they had raised had grown into the men and women who would carry the Ashford name into the next century. Lenora Cordelia, 23 years old, now had just finished her medical training at a school in Iowa and was home for 2 weeks before she went to take up her first practice in a small town in eastern Montana. Nathaniel was running his own ranch over the ridge with 2 hands of his own. Charlotte had married a young preacher the summer before. Wyatt Jr., 14 and already nearly 6 feet tall, was inside the cabin with his Uncle Crawford learning to play the harmonica. Wyatt Ashford squeezed his wife's hand. "Adelaide," he said. "Yes. Do you remember the night you came up this mountain?" She smiled. The smile of a woman who has been asked the same question by the same man for 25 years and never gets tired of it. "Every day," she said. "Every day for 25 years, my love." He nodded. He looked out across the long blue shadows of the Bitterroot evening, seeing the same shadows he had looked at on the night he had stood at his window for an hour, waiting for someone he did not know to come up his trail. He thought about the man he had been then. He thought about the man he had become because of her. "I wrote that letter because I was lonely," he said. "I never thought God would send an angel in a snowstorm." She laid her head on his shoulder the way she had laid it 10,000 times before, the way she had been laying it since the first warm spring of their marriage, when she had finally stopped being shy of touching him in the daytime. "I remember the last steps to your door, Wyatt," she said. "I thought I was going to die. I thought my whole life was over." She lifted her face and looked at him in the soft golden light of the dying sun. "I did not know that was the day my life began." He bent his head and kissed her forehead the way he had kissed her on the night he had first sat by her bed in the small back bedroom and made her 3 quiet promises. He had kept all 3 of them. He had kept them every day for 25 years. The sun went down behind the Bitterroot peaks. The light turned the snow on the high country to gold, and then to rose, and then to a deep blue, silver, the color of the dress Adelaide had been wearing on the night she had come. Penny sighed at their feet. Inside the cabin, the harmonica played a slow, soft tune, the same tune Crawford had been playing on the morning Adelaide had set a flour sack down the center of the long pine table and changed everything in a house that had been silent for too long. The first stars came out over Bitterroot Ridge. Wyatt Ashford held his wife's hand in the cooling air, and Adelaide Ashford kept her head on his shoulder. And the cabin behind them stood as it had stood for 40 years, built by hands that had loved it, kept by hands that had earned it, warmed by a fire that had been lit on the night a stranger had walked out of a blizzard into a doorway and into a life she had not known she was walking into until she was already inside it and the door had closed gently behind her against the wind. The mountain was quiet. The mountain had given them everything it had to give. The mountain was their home, and they were its people. And there was nothing left in the world that needed saying that had not already been said 1,000 times in 1,000 small ways across 25 years of mornings and evenings and harvests and hard winters and the long, slow, patient work of 2 people who had decided to build a life together and had then gone ahead and built it. Adelaide closed her eyes. The wind came down off the high country one last time the way it always did, and it carried with it the smell of pine sap and wood smoke from a cabin on a ridge. And it carried something else, something older, something that the woman from Boston had finally come to understand after a quarter of a century in the high country. It carried the smell of home.